Thank you very much. What a wonderful introduction. Thank you very much. Yeah, Centre for Innovative Ageing spells CIA, so everyone can remember it. I'm from the CIA, so listen up, and it's very important. Right, so delighted to be here this afternoon with you. Thanks for hanging around and not disappearing to your rooms, which must be gorgeous, by the way. I'm not staying over, so I'm very jealous. But if they're anything like the public rooms, it must be amazing. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the research I've been doing with particularly older drivers. I do look at older pedestrians, older people in the built environment in general, but today older drivers, and in particular looking at the environmental influences on older drivers. So there's the plan of the talk. I guess I give you an insight into the answer to the second one there. So first of all, ageing, we're all at it, but are older drivers safe? If I have to go into improving safety of older drivers, I guess the answer to that is probably not that safe. But I'll show you where they're safe and where they're not safe by the types of collision that they have. So first of all, you know, this is a really nice way to end the day. We're doing something wonderful, actually. This is really good. We're all aging successfully. Look at it in 1901. There was hardly anyone over the age of 80, 85. Look, really narrow and thin at the top. Now have a look at that bulbous population pyramid. By 2014, we've become much fatter, lots and lots of people over the age of 80, and that does reflect the sort of obesity epidemic, doesn't it, as well, that we're facing now. By 2039, there's a massive increase if you look over the age of, particularly over the age of 70, both for males and females. And that's the same across lots of Western society and across the world. So given that, it's not surprising to notice we have these kind of statistics come out. So huge increase in license holders and a huge increase in the number of miles driven amongst older people. Look at that, in 1975, less than 10%, it's around 4 or 5% of older females had a driving license. And that's changed to almost 50% now. And a similar pattern in terms of males, but almost up to 100% for that. But whereas we saw a slight reduction across miles driven for the whole of the population, older people in particular, particularly the 70 plus age group, driving more miles than ever before. That's because they're more fit, more healthy, potentially many of them are more wealthy as well. They want to get out and about, they want to have where they've been able to have a nice retirement and enjoy later life. They're certainly more doing more driving. We know mobility is important for health and it's important for well-being, and we know in particular that giving up driving is related to a decrease in well-being and an increase in depression and other related health issues. Some studies even show an increase in mortality for people who have to give up driving. So therefore we talk about it being a major life event. We talk about retirement being a major life event, but so nowadays is retirement for driving, which is quite a substantial and important thing to say. And why is that? Really, for the main reasons come down, of course, to a reduction in activity and things. It's much harder. We've got what we call a hypermobile society these days, where we think nothing of coming all the way from Swansea to Coventry to give a talk and then going back in the evening. We think of nothing of linking to family and friends all around the country and travelling out and about seeing that. And older people are no different to that. It's also those smaller journeys for healthcare, for checkups. It's for going to hospital, shops and appointments and things like that. But they're not all boring like that. They also like doing fun things, and that's good for their health as well. You know, like going to the pub, like going to the theatre and things like that. It's often forgotten about, and that's important for health and well-being too. But the hypermobile society means they've got to drive those things more often than not in this day and age. But also, don't forget the social or affective element of mobility, which I think is really important. And it's kind of hovered around in lots of the presentations from today, that there's that emotive content to mobility and an emotive content to driving in particular. There's linked to things like independence and freedom, expressing something about yourself. And that particularly comes out in later life when people have to give up their car, that they feel that they've lost their independence, that they feel potentially that they're ready for scrappy. It's not normal to not have a car in this day and age, perhaps outside of London. That's how older people talk to me about their mobility, which I suppose is a rather sad state of affairs, really. But that's how it is. But if we're going to increase older drivers on the road and allow them to continue to drive, are they safe or not, is the first question to ask. if you have a look at the newspapers, you will see plenty of examples where elderly and older drivers are reported as not being safe. Look at poor old 93-year-old Jack Higgs there. Look how embarrassed he looks after turning over his £600 Ford Fiesta and causing £60,000 worth of damage on that nice Porsche garage there. Similarly, you can't go a day or two without seeing some story of a mobility scooter going down the motorway. Even better if it's going the wrong way down the motorway, particular problem of highways. Mobility scooters is always being reported. And then, of course, there's the more serious and sad state of affairs where you see older drivers involved in some pretty horrific collisions, often through, in this instance, making one small mistake, not picking up the ordinary cues of the motorway and joining it the wrong way round when it's potentially quite empty, but then hitting something head on. So if you take what the newspapers say, you won't be surprised to think that they're more dangerous on the road. And when you have a look at the things that happen to us all as we age, and it happens to us really from the age of about possibly around 20 years onwards, I'm afraid, that we all begin to deteriorate in things like cognition, in eyesight in particular, even things like changes in our own mobility. So in particular, I've brought out some of the things there that are related to issues that affect an older driver. So selective sustained attention is poorer, task switching ability is poorer, eyesight is a particular issue, particularly things like recovery from glare of other vehicles or a low sun. Older drivers might require up to around 32 times the brightness they did as somebody the age of 25. And of course, that change in mobility, fatigue comes out as well. This is rather sad and depressing, isn't it? But of course, not everybody ages in exactly the same kind of way. But it does end up perhaps with these kind of things that older drivers have typical difficulty with. Overall, not having the full awareness to make a decision, and particularly not having that full awareness to make a decision under a time constraint, whether that's real or imagined. So you've got to make quick decisions based on a number of pieces of information. That takes a lot longer as we begin to age. One of the problems, of course, with that is that we don't notice some of those changes as we age. They happen to us incrementally, they happen day on day. They're not things that just suddenly happen to us usually, unless through illness. So it's not something that we adapt to particularly consciously. It's things that we perhaps adapt to subconsciously. Perhaps we're not adapting particularly very well, and then it may end up with some of these things coming out. So look, didn't see, gap acceptance, being distracted by other things going on, and reaction times being a lot slower. So it's not surprising perhaps to see that from around 75 years of age, older drivers are overrepresented in the casualty data as we see it. However, when we looked at that a little bit more in depth, I did a very crude example of that by just looking at percentage of deaths to casualties. We wanted to see if they were overrepresented in those casualties just because they're more likely to be a statistic, because they're frail, for example. And I didn't do that very well because I only did that. Kit Mitchell, who some of you will know, did a much better version of that for me, looking at matching where we've got severity data, and some of that's from Great Britain, but he managed to do that in other countries as well, where we've got severity of collision, where we're not basing the severity on the injured casualty, to see if where there's been a similar rate of impact that we can rate whether older people are more likely to be a statistic. And he's suggesting in the research that they are. So therefore, we might conclude from that that older people are not more likely to be a statistic in actual fact. So there's some good news. Now, why might that be? You can't see in that black line there. I'm supposed to give you some examples of why those two things don't actually tie together always. Some of that's due to experience of older people themselves. That's what they always tell me. I'm a great driver. I've had 60 years of experience. I know what's going on. I'm able to drive with a little bit more insight than I was when I was 20 and that kind of thing. But actually what we really think is going on is lots of compensatory behaviour between the left-hand column and the right-hand column there. So lots of being able to not have to go out when it's rush hour and it's busy, not using roads that are not very comfortable on, not using going out when the weather's bad, for example, and that kind of thing. But are older drivers going to be able to do that forever? Not if we're going to continue working later on in life, potentially. We're not going to have so much choice. as we age than older drivers have at the moment. And also, you know, how good are we at being able to compensate for these things anyway? Can we tell when we've got those changes, particularly as they're incremental, that we can then make the changes that mean we don't end up being a statistic? When we look a little bit more in depth at some of the Stats 19 data, we do see some patterns that are a little bit more alarming and might need some work done. And these have been done before for years. Not surprisingly, therefore, older drivers end up having more contributory factors towards collision they've been involved with on the Stats 19 data set from the age of about 75 onwards again, so more than younger people have. And when we look at what those contributory factors are, and this has been done for a number of years and we've redone it again recently, you'll see that particularly it's one issue, and that's turning right across traffic in Great Britain. So that's turning right at a junction without very much control across traffic. So there, turning right across traffic from the Stats 19 data set we looked at over 10 years is more significant for over 70s. Failed to look properly, failed to judge other vehicle or person's path, and performed a poor manoeuvre are all significant errors that older people make in their collisions. So they're all things that we need to think about improving in later life. And there's an interesting statistic that's worth looking at, and we ought to look at it again more recently using UK data. This was something that Jim Langford looked at about 10 years ago or so, looking at data of people and how much they drove per year and whether they had collisions or not. Those who drive only a few number of miles over the age of 75 are those that are contributing mostly to those collision statistics. Those that drive more miles tail off. Why that might be, we're not entirely sure. It might be the type of roads that people drive on when they're driving further miles, like motorways, particularly safe roads per mile driven. It might be that there's self-selection going on there, that the poorer drivers don't drive quite so much. We're not quite sure. So it's worth revisiting that. So what are we going to do about this element where we have got some older drivers that are having more collisions? This is the bit, I think, that looks a bit like the Swiss cheese model. We really don't know a lot about the answers for this bit, as you'll see. Plenty of opportunities for research. So if I take them in turn, we could change the infrastructure, which is something that we've talked a lot about today. Both Australia and the US have a highway design manual specifically written for older people. And it talks about those things that older people have particular difficulties with. So merges onto main roads, merges onto motorways, and the suggestion we could protect those lanes or at least have longer slip roads. A lot of older people avoid motorway driving, which is a shame because it's pretty safe per mile driven. And the main reason for that is not overload on the motorway itself, it's the merging on that they're very anxious about. So changes in that would help particularly. Increasing markings as a whole really helps. Particularly at those right-hand turns at intersections, roundabouts rather than T-junctions are safer for older people. Having give way and stop signs really helps rather than having no turns, and particularly traffic signals. Of course, you can't always do all of those things, but they all help older people. Better signage, larger lettering, better reflective surfaces. So many signage you see these days, so particularly poor quality or dirty or need cleaning, can't be seen. I get loads of complaints about that from older people. Sometimes I'm acting as a highways agency go-between, I'm sure. The thing is, when I look at some of the evidence of whether these make a difference or not, and you look at the evidence in the highway design manual, a lot of them will be done on simulation. A lot of them are done with older drivers only, so they're not comparing older drivers with younger drivers and the effects of that on the road. In a real-life situation, what might the road layout look like? We don't have a road where just older people drive down and another road where younger people drive down. Everybody interacts together. It's that social situation of the road. So if we change the road layout to be more sort of more intuitive for an older person, does it mean that younger drivers will end up driving a lot faster, for example? And we can't assume that changing something for the benefit of older people will be for the benefit of everyone. Will it improve pedestrian ability to use that road, for example, as well? We could change the vehicle. So moving towards driverless or automated vehicles, for example. We could add systems that give more information for older people. Older people quite like that. They like things like head-up displays. They like to be able to prioritize and manage those displays. They quite like it if they have the outside signs displayed on their windscreen, for example, at the same focus level as looking ahead. They quite like to be able to use sat-nav in this day and age where it tells them what to do. Advisory systems, some of them quite like those systems, so it tells you when you've reached a certain speed, tells you to slow down, tells you that there's trouble ahead, advises you on what to do. Takeover systems are particularly not liked amongst older people until they've tried to use some of them. So I think that's quite an interesting point in terms of theory and in terms of philosophy, because a lot of what we do in road safety terms is think that attitude comes first and then we need to change that. But in fact, sometimes you change the infrastructure and it will change people's attitudes. And that particularly comes out with some of those takeover systems. I must admit, in the research we did with some takeover systems, we did it about 8 or 9 years ago with some Jaguars. So maybe it was the fact they were using Jaguars that they liked rather than the takeover systems themselves. But there is something about changing that. Sometimes we need to be bold and make a change first. This is what the Daily Mail always want, more testing for older people. Stick them on a driving test every couple of years, particularly from 70 onwards. But there's absolutely no evidence in any country at all where they have more stringent tests, whether that's cognitive testing, whether that's a more driving-based test, whether that's simulated test, whether that's more medical-based test, that it makes any difference at all to collision rates of the country as a whole and also to older people themselves. There's only a little bit of evidence that better eyesight testing can make a change. Some evidence from the States, although that data for that isn't particularly well done. So the upshot of that, of course, is testing might be the issue. You might be doing, you might want to introduce testing. It just might not be testing the right thing in the way that we're doing it at the moment. We could enhance that compensatory behaviour that seems to do quite well for older people at the moment. Maybe that's just through dialogue and information. There's lots of research out there talking about the role of, for example, doctors and GP and health professionals telling older people when it's time to give up driving or encouraging them to think about going for extra testing. We've got the DVLA working with us to look at how we might improve some of the dialogue that we give to older drivers when they're reaching the decision to give up driving. I put nudge on there. Is there ways we can nudge older people to do that kind of thing? Potentially graduated licensing examples, as we have for younger drivers as well. But again, how do we do that? We just don't know at the moment how to provide that information and the best way to do that information. It seems some people take on board that information better than others. Men are particularly bad at taking on board information about their own driving, by the way. Education and testing, look at this chap using that state-of-the-art simulator there. I don't think all of the education and training centres are as bad as that. But again, we don't quite know what education and training should look like for older drivers. There's some research that tends to say self-reported driver behaviours improve, driver knowledge improves. Some tentative evidence say on-road driving assessments might improve or show improvement after a bit of education and training, but that doesn't last beyond 3 to 6 months. And there's no evidence to suggest they reduce crashes or injuries resulting from crashes at all at the moment. So there's potential there, but we don't have the research or the evidence to say that works. And finally, the other thing, of course, is to offer a better alternative. The fact that people are totally wedded to their vehicles and possibly more wedded to their vehicles than ever before in later life might be because of necessity rather than anything else. When we design a built environment where older people can't get out and about for one reason or another, they are more likely to be stuck to their car. Look at the picture at the top there. That's a bench in Porth Cool. They've just put 3 of those in along the seafront, and they've put them facing the road. The sea is this way. Interestingly, the local authorities got away with it by calling them the new selfie benches. So you're supposed to take a selfie in the sea. But nobody's buying that, really. So they put them in the wrong way around, for example. At least they've got benches, which is more perhaps than some areas have. But public conveniences in the local neighbourhood, making them attractive, somewhere you want to go and spend time. the importance of good quality public transport and community transport. Think how much effort that car manufacturers put into making cars desirable, attractive, sexy. Do buses do the same kind of thing? Probably not. It's a little bit tentative evidence to say it's beginning to. Leather seats, Wi-Fi for the first time ever. But largely very practical vessels, particularly community transport, so often a very old-fashioned minibus and not desirable in any shape or form. And that's really where I end, apart from just to emphasise those elements there. So there's a growing importance to study older people as there's more and more of them and they're taking up more of our society. We all want to get it right for when we retire, for example. They're not particularly unsafe drivers at the moment, don't add a lot to the collision statistics, but there are specific errors that certain older people are making. So how do we offer solutions for that? And I think it's very important, we've been thinking about how we do that. Systems approach is definitely very important to that. A lot of the stuff I see in terms of improving older drivers, particularly infrastructure-based things, definitely feels that sort of half-filled balloon element. You solve one particular problem, but you've pushed that problem to somewhere else. There's side effects from not taking a systems approach to things. There's compensatory behaviour that older people make at the moment, but will that be able to continue as we're all working later on in life? We're going to have, lorry drivers, coach drivers, bus drivers, professional drivers driving later on in life will all be commuting for much later on in life. Sorry, it's sad, isn't it? There are some examples where some solutions particularly work, and I've put them on there, but what's the balance of that? What's the right mix, and who's responsible for delivering some of those things, and how do you put it together as a package? How do you put that together in terms of a system so that it's not all individual isolated elements? And also we need to involve older people much more in the decision making of safety systems that they're going to be affected and part of. We need to consider the effect on older drivers as we make changes to the infrastructure, in other words. So we can't assume that one element that we put in that affects certain types of driver won't affect older drivers in a very different kind of way. So much more involvement of older people is needed in that process.